With the unemployment rate as high as it still is, a crucial question that must be answered is, who creates jobs? Is it the 1% or middle-class consumers? That's at the heart of the debate we're going to have today. I'm joined by two business leaders. On my right is Ed Conard. He is the former Bain Capital partner, an unabashed member of the so-called 1%. And he says it is he and his colleagues who are largely responsible for job creation. Nick Hanauer is an entrepreneur and venture capitalist, also a member of the 1%. He says that when business people take credit for creating jobs, it's like squirrels taking credit for evolution. So let's start. Ed's got a book out, and we've had him on the show before,
Sure.
so you get the first word. Why is it like squirrels taking credit for evolution?
Look, if investment was the key, then there would be Apple stores in Somalia, and there would be a Bain Capital office in Bangladesh. The goose that lays the golden egg is not people like Ed and myself. We are a dime a dozen. The greatest economic achievement of the 20th century has been the creation of the American middle class. It is demand, it is customers that drive all economic activity. Look, the world is awash in capital. American corporations are sitting on $2 trillion worth of cash. Ed's firm alone has raised $35 billion in private equity. I'm in the venture capital. You can fund any cockamamie idea. The world is awash.
Well, tell the people in Africa and India that the world is awash in capital.
It is awash in capital. What we lack today are consumers. The only reason any company invests, the only reason any company hires someone is because they believe they're going to have a customer for that. Look, anyone who's ever run a business knows that a capitalist hires more people only as a course of last resort. When there are no options available other than meeting increasing demand from customers.
But at some point, presumably, this logic does apply, which is that if the middle class, if the majority, if 80–90% have lower and lower incomes, the fact that they don't have much purchasing power will affect demand.
Look, I think there's two problems with the argument. First of all, we know why there's no Apple store in Thailand, okay? Because there isn't a lot of capital per worker, there isn't a lot of training per worker, and there isn't a lot of innovation there compared to there is in the U.S., and that has driven incomes way up in the U.S. relative, and that's why we can afford Apple computers and things like that. So if you don't have the investment in place, first of all, you don't get the consumption after the fact. Now, you can run the math, and the assumption in the math is that if you lower the incentives for risk-taking, if you lower the investment that goes into risk-taking, if you lower the capital, the equity that underwrites the risk-taking, that you will get the kind of growth in the middle class that the U.S. has been able to achieve. Well, we can look at real-world experiments out there, and we don't find one where that's true. We have three great real-world experiments, the U.S., Europe, and Japan. Okay, our median incomes are 25% higher than Europe's. Our median incomes have grown relative to Europe's and Japan. We can spread the income over a lot of employees, which we have because we've grown our employment much faster and much greater than they have grown theirs. Or we can restrict the supply of labor, for example, and drive the wages up to a certain extent. But either way, what matters is how much income you've created, and we are creating way more income at the median than Europe and Japan are creating. And that is because innovation is driving our economy, so we can say, hey, we'll take away the incentives, we'll take away the equity, we'll take away the investment, but we'll get the growth anyway. Because God blessed America with entrepreneurial spirit. So usually where the argument
Ed and I are in violent agreement that innovation is an extraordinarily important thing. Where we diverge is this idea that we have to lower tax rates to these unbelievably low levels in order to have it. And it's just, so this is my world. And the idea that you have to have a 15% capital gains tax rate in order for people to start companies, first of all, reduces people like me and other entrepreneurs to sociopathic money grubbers who only do what we do for $1. And that is categorically untrue. We start companies because we want to change the world, solve a problem, be king of the hill, be our own boss. By this logic, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs made a terrible mistake by starting their companies because tax rates were 2.5 or 3 times higher then than they are now.
Let me ask you what you would change, because even if your argument is true, wouldn't it be fair to say the United States does provide enormous incentives for rich people to invest. I mean, taxes are, historically speaking, at least, much lower than they were in the 1970s when Microsoft and Apple were founded. Marginal tax rates were 75%. Capital gains tax rates, I think, were in the 40s. So do you think that tax rates need to be further reduced?
I would be very, very careful about reducing the incentives for risk takers, and I would be working very hard to lower the spending. And I think there's agreement on the left and the right that we have to we have to substantially reduce the spending over the long run if we want to preserve the growth rates and the benefits that we have been able to provide for the middle class relative to Europe and Japan if we want to continue that success.
But you want to invest. I mean, the spending you're talking about is basically investment in the middle class.
Absolutely. But I just want to address this risk thing for a moment because I find it absurd. I mean, if you think about the iconic so-called risk takers in our economy, Bezos, Zuckerberg, Gates, the Google guys. So just imagine their lives, right? So the Google guys, and God bless them, they've done a great thing, but they grow up in families where their parents are professors of mathematics and computer science. So far, no risk. They go to Stanford University to get PhDs in computer science. Other than being born in the British royal family, no institution on earth more insulates you from risk than a PhD in computer science from Stanford. At the best time in human history, in the best place in human history, they go off to live the dream and start an internet company in Silicon Valley in the mid-90s. So far, no risk. The money that goes into Google comes from venture capitalists. You'd think maybe they took a risk, but not really, because venture capitalists, like private equity people, make money whether the deal works or not. The only people who took a risk in this entire chain are the working people whose pension funds the venture capital company invested in Google, because if Google goes bankrupt, those people will actually lose their money. There's this idea that we owe the so-called risk takers fealty or special tax treatment is utterly absurd. It's just not true and not fair.
You're making a moral argument as opposed to an economic argument. All you really care about is how do you get the risk-taking that benefits the middle class at the lowest possible cost.
I would agree with that.
Now, Thomas Edison said, success is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. Business is a team sport. It's not about two guys sitting in their dorm room at Stanford, okay? It's about attracting a lot of talent to that company to make that company successful and getting those people to walk away from companies like Microsoft and Google, the companies that they're walking away from. It doesn't matter whether it's moral or not. It's what's the economic cost to get those guys to walk away to create the next Google, the next Facebook. And it's not the after-the-fact payoff of billions of dollars. It's before the fact when they have a 1 in a million chance. And they recognize that unless they get a little more equity, they have very little chance of producing as much income and wealth as they would have if they just would have stayed at their job at Google and Facebook as opposed to walking away and taking the risk. And we have been able to do it, and Europe and Japan have been singularly unsuccessful in accomplishing this. Their most talented people go to the beach. Our top 20% are the only people in the high-wage economies, because as you get more money, you work less. We're the only place in the high-wage economies where people are working more hours, not less hours, and that is beneficial to the middle class and the working poor throughout the world. The U.S. innovation is what is driving the growth rate.
Thank you, gentlemen. Wonderful debate. Maybe we'll have round two in a while.
Let's just go.